The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the University of Alberta, the Students' Union, or CJSR.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. Today's show is all about a classic skeptical topic, cryptozoology. Are there curious creatures lurking in the hidden corners of the world? Do unknown hominids stalk through vast, uninhabited forests? Are our lakes teeming with mysterious monsters? Or is this fictional fauna more fancy than fact? We'll talk to Blake Smith and Dr. Karen Stollznow, two of the hosts of the MonsterTalk podcast, to learn just what cryptozoology is, what it isn't, and if there's any evidence for the existence of these amazing animals. But first, to speaking up. We're here today with Myron Getman. Myron's a geologist for the New York State Department of Health. He's been a skeptic informally for many years, but for the last two, he's maintained the Mad Skeptic blog. And since childhood, Bigfoot has been his favorite monster, which has led him to the examination of cryptozoology. Welcome to Speaking Up, Myron.
Howdy do.
So you sent us an email about how you hold the position that cryptozoology is detrimental to the understanding of science.
I do. I don't mean that in the sense that it sparks curiosity. That is always good. But before I get any further, you did point out that Bigfoot was one of my biggest things when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it still kind of is, Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster. It was my favorite, and it scared you can't say that on the radio, out of me when I was a little kid. And so my natural instinct was to read up on things. And so I have a collection of some of the worst pulp fiction that you could ever get that was published as nonfiction. And so all these Bigfoot books. I was, I guess you could say, a believer when I was younger. As I got older and I started to understand how the scientific method works, then obviously I kind of said, well, this would be really cool if it was true. And there is a slim chance it's possible that there is something like Bigfoot lurking around out there, but there's no evidence for it. And while I'm kind of disappointed that, this creature, as far as I believe right now, doesn't exist, there is something happening, and so that's legitimate, and that's why are people seeing these things. And I think that's every bit as interesting as the possibility of a creature lurking around out there. Why are people saying these things? They're seeing these things or claiming to see these things.
The psychological aspect, you're saying.
Yeah, It's not everyone going out and tying one on and driving their pickup truck and then deciding to throw a hoax up in the air and see what happens. There's something happening. And like I said, I was kind of a believer, and I actually myself was involved in kind of a Bigfoot thing that happened a few years ago in upstate New York. It was a coincidental thing at a summer camp that I worked at. The waterfront staff said that they had an interaction with something. They never said it was Bigfoot. And then the following morning, I had a fish and wildlife studies class that I was taking out, and we found something that looked like a footprint. The two stories kind of conjoined, and it became into this story of a Bigfoot was threatening the waterfront staff the night before, and I discovered the evidence of this Bigfoot the next morning. When I went back, and I've written about this, when I went back and thought about it later on, too many things had reasonable explanations that were never considered. The waterfront staff, for example, said that something was throwing rocks at them, but they never saw any rocks, and they never saw anything throw them. And there was a family of beavers that lived in this pond, and anyone's from beavers knows they slap their tails when they feel threatened. So I'm pretty certain what happened was it was just a whole comedy of errors in a summer camp, which was having a bad summer for morale and everything, and we kind of needed this sort of something to unify us, and it just happened to have been this Bigfoot incident. But at the time, I kind of fell into it. I was like the Bigfoot expert. I mean, I guess I'm a little tainted on the story, but I kind of look back at that, and I'm like, wow, I acted like an ass. I was arguing from authority, and I was arguing from ignorance at the same time.
Well, how often do you think that happens with a lot of these stories?
I think it happens most of the time. something will happen. It will be misinterpreted, or it's a complete hoax. The hoaxes take them out of the picture. The ones that are misinterpretations, I think they're well-meaning people who legitimately see something. They're not making something up. They don't have some sort of medication issue. They see something out of the corner of their eye, and they just don't know what it is. And it goes from there. And then our minds fill in the blanks with what we don't know. I'm pretty certain someone who's up in upstate New York right now hunting, well, I can't say right now, but this day and age hunting for deer in the Adirondacks, if they saw the shoulder of a moose, which have been out of the Adirondacks for the past 100 and whatever years, would certainly think it's a Bigfoot or something huge, because deer don't stand that tall, and a moose at the shoulder is about 7 foot, give or take. So now that moose are back in the area, one of those things moves in the underbrush, I don't think they're going to think it's a dinosaur. I think they'd think it's Bigfoot.
Right.
Or, just as an example. But there is something going on, and most of these people are legitimately curious about what's going on. Now, that really isn't my problem with these creatures, if you want to call them that. My problem is with what calls itself cryptozoology, the actual field, if you want to put the scare quotes around that, of cryptozoology. And I think what that is a pseudoscience. It encapsulates the trappings of science, uses science-sounding words. Some of them are real science words, and it borrows from legitimate sciences like biology and zoology and so on. But the one thing that it's missing is it's completely devoid of the actual application of the scientific method. Now, when someone sees something that they don't understand and they want to figure out what it is, most inquisitive people are going to try to trace back and say, what's the most likely thing? Some people, however, are going to immediately jump to a conclusion and then overlook all of the data or information otherwise that could disprove that. And there's plenty of websites out there that people can go and find things like this, like Cryptomundo and things like that, where you find an entirely credulous, I don't want to say reporting, regurgitation of these stories. Now, Cryptomundo does it a little better than some others in that there's at least a facade of skepticism on that site. However, I have no doubt that Lauren Coleman is a true believer, and nothing's going to prove otherwise. And that's where the most significant portion of a pseudoscience comes in, is that they start from an assumption and they set out to prove it. And then they just use their plain out positive confirmation bias, or I don't want to say fraud, but just eliminating the data that disproves our position that something does or doesn't exist.
Would you say then that one of the issues is that if people do have some sort of strange experience like you had with Bigfoot, and they do their quick Google search, that they might find something like Cryptomundo and just sort of stop there and stop doing any more research?
I think most people who are not well educated in science are probably going to do something like that. They may not just stop at Cryptomundo, but they're only going to glean over things. If they have the idea that Bigfoot is what they saw, they're going to Google for Bigfoot. The likelihood that they're going to be searching for large ungulates in the northeast of New York is unlikely.
Right.
If you Google Bigfoot, you're going to get all kinds of flashy-looking sites. I mean, some of them honestly are nauseating to look at because there's something from like GeoCities with sparkling stars and stuff, and like Biscardi's site. Oh, don't look at that thing; it'll make you ill. That's where I have my biggest problem.
Right.
Is there's not enough critical thinking, and my problem with cryptozoology in particular is this affectation of science, which it propagates itself backwards in a way, because let's say a story happens, people become interested, it gets into the paper will credulously report it. As a very good example of that, just recently, the Drudge Report had now this is something different, it's tangential, but it's the same effect. The Drudge Report just had one of their links to a Sun article. Now, the Sun is not really the best paper in the world, but the title was Noah's Ark Discovered.
Right.
And it just credulously reports that. Now, it's in the Sun. Now, a lot of people in the UK, at least, are going to understand, well, the Sun, well, you can wrap fish with that. But here in the States, you get a link from the Sun that's on the Drudge Report there's a lot of people who are going to believe what that thing says. And they're not going to do any backstory on it. They're not going to do anything to follow up on it. And those people, just accept that fact. Now their kids are seeing that. They're accepting that fact. It kind of propagates itself.
There's another problem that I worry about, actually, that people may not understand the difference between cryptozoology and regular biology that's just finding new animals all the time.
Yes. And field zoology and these others. And the cryptozoologists, they will go out of the way to blur the understanding. And again, you can see this on a lot of the blogs.
There are people who are involved in cryptozoology, though, who are skeptics, who are using the scientific method. People like Blake Smith and Dr. Karen Stollznow. And they're actually from the MonsterTalk podcast, and they're actually going to be on later this evening. So you think it's less likely that people will end up thinking about cryptozoology like the MonsterTalk guys, and more likely to end up thinking that it's possible that there's a chupacabra in their backyard?
Yes, and I'm afraid that will bleed over. That acceptance of, let's say, a fantasy-prone belief system will bleed over into other things that require critical thought. I don't think it just necessarily ends with things like cryptozoology, or it ends with homeopathy, or it ends with insert your pseudoscience here.
Right.
It bleeds over into other things where just people accept things. And the second that we stop questioning and we start accepting things, we're just opening ourselves up for a whole lot of trouble. I mean, anyone who's read Huxley's Brave New World can probably understand where I'm coming from with this, at least within a fictional context. Or 1984 by Orwell. Now, it's not that it's that extreme, but we can let ourselves be put over upon, whether it be through science and critical thinking or not, if we don't use our minds.
So what's your suggestion then?
Well, I think the ideal would be something like MonsterTalk or Daniel Loxton's type stuff, where you use the occurrence of a cryptozoological event, like the Patterson film, or just pick anything, the surgeon's photo from Loch Ness, and you use that as a case study that you can then educate with. And this could be done on most basic levels for kids in school, in middle schools and up, because that's where they get instructed in their critical thinking skills. And I would love, of course, we've all been saying this, I would love to see more skeptical television and things like that. MonsterTalk could have a television show where they go and they examine things, and that got as much play as Monster Quest did. I think we would be in a lot better place than we are right now.
Thanks very much for being here, Myron.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
You can read more from Myron at themadskeptic.com. And we'll be right back with more cryptozoology right after this.
You were listening to Skeptically Speaking, either through the wonder of podcast technology or the generosity of one of our rebroadcasting stations. Skeptically Speaking is broadcast live out of CJSR 88.5 Edmonton, Alberta at 6 p.m. Mountain Time every Friday. If you're not in Edmonton, you can still hear the broadcast live on our Ustream.tv feed, which you can find by clicking on the Listen Live link on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also participate in the chat room and submit questions. During the week leading up to each show, you can find information on the upcoming episode and guest, and submit a question to be asked in the air. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Our deepest thanks go to those stations who donate their valuable airtime to our program, including Citywide LPFM 99.1 FM in Madison, Wisconsin, CILY Kootenai Cooperative Radio 93.5 FM in Nelson, 96.5 FM in Crawford Bay, and 107.5 FM in New Denver, British Columbia, CIVL 101.7 FM in Abbotsford, British Columbia, CJAI Amherst Island Public Radio 92.1 FM in Stella, Ontario, CLHI Rosslyn Radio 101.1 FM in Rosslyn, British Columbia, Free Thought Radio, WPRR Public Reality Radio 1680 AM in Grand Rapids, Michigan, CIDO 97.7 FM in Creston, British Columbia, UMFM 101.5 FM in Winnipeg, Manitoba, CFAD 92.1 FM in Salmo, British Columbia, CKOA FM, The Coast 89.7 FM in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and CKMS 100.3 Sound FM in Waterloo, Ontario.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. We're on the line with two of the hosts of the MonsterTalk podcast, one of the official podcasts of Skeptic Magazine. Blake Smith is a writer and researcher of matters cryptozoological and paranormal. He's been interested in the mysterious for decades and has been a formal skeptic of those kinds of claims since 1997. Dr. Karen Stollznow is a linguist and researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. She devotes her spare time to investigating pseudoscientific and paranormal beliefs and practices, including ghosts, psychics, alternative therapies, conspiracy theories, haunted houses, and more. Blake and Karen, welcome to Skeptically Speaking.
Hello.
Hi.
So let's start with some basic definitions. What's the monster in MonsterTalk?
Oh, that's a good question. I wanted that to be very open and vague, and I thought about that a lot before even this interview. To me, a monster is anything unusual or something to be afraid of, or not necessarily that you should be afraid of it, but something that you would be afraid of. So I wanted it to be able to encompass many topics, not just cryptozoological topics, so that we could talk about aliens or ghosts as well as the classics like Bigfoot and Nessie. And so far we've gotten to touch on some of those. We've touched on aliens and ghosts very recently, and it kind of keeps the show with a huge spectrum of issues that we can talk about without us running into a rut of Bigfoot.
And asking what is a monster is something that we treat in our latest episode too with Dr. Marcus Davis. He goes into the history of the word monster and what does it mean.
So you do cover more than cryptozoology in MonsterTalk then?
Absolutely.
In a broad sense.
So what's your working definition then of cryptozoology?
Well, cryptozoology has sort of a standard definition that it's the study of hidden or mystery animals. And for most people, this means animals that may exist but have not been proven to exist, but which definitely exist within folklore. I think that's an important distinction. In the history of cryptozoology, there haven't been a lot of what you would call big finds where an animal in folklore has turned out to be true since the early 20th century. So things like the wild man of the woods, who turns out to be an orangutan, that would be considered a hit. But something like coelacanth, which doesn't have any folkloric history, it was presumed extinct, but it's a fish that, while alive millions of years, people didn't know it was still alive until I think the 1930s. So even though they found that fish, it turned out to be alive. I don't think that really justifies being called a cryptid or one of those kind of mystery animals.
Cryptozoology does include as well creatures which are known to be extinct, but people claim that they've had sightings of them recently.
Absolutely. Living dinosaurs. And
so, legendary animals and ones which have formerly existed, so people think they see.
Does cryptozoology actually share any methods or strategies with zoology, or is it a completely different field?
Ooh, good question. Well, I'm not sure that it follows any of the same methodology. I mean, they certainly read the same journals looking for information, but
right.
The average cryptozoologist, I think, would be looking for mystery animals and asking people what they've seen, looking for claims, and then trying to, if they were an active field researcher, to go to those sites and look to see if they could find any evidence of the creature. But the thing is, they're going to be looking for the thing that was described. And I think a distinction from a scientific perspective would be to look at the claim and see what was being reported, and then figure out whether the evidence really supports such a claim. So, for example, like Bigfoot started off with footprints. Well, the footprints got a story to go back and backfill. That obviously, if there's a humanoid footprint that's enormous, there must be a giant person to fit that spot. And then hoaxers have sort of made that come true, and then people have built this expectation that there is a giant hairy humanoid out there in the woods. But I don't think there's any solid evidence for that, and I don't say that lightly. I'm prepared to come out and say that I am tentatively taking the position that there is no Bigfoot, even though I'm open to evidence otherwise.
We have no show anymore.
Oh, no!
So you talk about sort of the ways that you should be doing this. So are there any educational institutions, perhaps, that teach cryptozoology?
It's not an academic field as such. I think there are comparisons with Egyptology, which isn't really part of ancient history or anything like that. It's a sort of fringe science. It's not mainstream at all. So there's no formal or rigorous approach to studying cryptozoology at any university at all. I mean, not that means anything nowadays anyway.
Well, it's funny because Myron specifically mentioned Loren Coleman and said he thought Loren was a true believer. I'm not sure I agree with that particular point. Loren's been very skeptical in the sense of not taking a side on some big, cryptid creatures. He says he doesn't know if he believes in Bigfoot or not, but he's got the interesting position that he's one of the few people who is making his living off of cryptids. Who's, that's how he pays his bills. So it's certainly not in his best interest, were he to be actually very skeptical, to make that position known. He's much better off promoting doubt. That's much more likely to keep him having a continued income.
Right.
Just causes bills for me instead.
Right. Right. So we have to keep investigating things. But Loren, his site Cryptomundo, anytime a new animal is discovered, he'll post that. That'll be like a hit for cryptids. It's not. I don't think those count. So, and if you want, actually, you can get a degree in cryptozoology at Thunderwood College, which is an online web form you can fill out.
Oh, really?
Brian Dunning put that together. So.
Right.
That's where I got my PhD. So,
and not me.
Now, this is interesting to me because before I really started delving into the skeptical community and all the accompanying science, of course, I thought that cryptozoology was actually a formal discipline, like a more obscure branch of zoology. Just like I thought homeopathy was just natural medicine.
Homeopathy is taught at university level for some institutions, but yeah, I think that's like Myron was saying when he was talking about the affectation of science. I think that a field like cryptozoology, it sounds scientific in a sense. It sounds technical. And so it can have the semblance of science for many.
And it does have a lot to do with folklore. So, if you weren't adding on the part where people think these things are absolutely true, I think cryptozoology collects a lot of really obscure folklore in a good way. But then to take that folklore and then presume that one person's, passed down oral traditions necessarily constitutes a real and living creature is, I think, a step too far.
Yeah, I think as long as you differentiate between folklore and fact, then it's okay. But a lot of people can't make that distinction.
Right. Audience, if you have questions for Blake or Karen on cryptozoology, email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com or tweet us at Skeptical Radio. Myron actually did a very interesting speaking up piece, and I think it's a good stepping off point for a lot of things. He mentioned that cryptozoologists occasionally misinterpret or exaggerate a bit of the evidence. Is that common?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem to be deliberate, but yeah, it's very common. But if you study the cases, let me just back up for just a second. It's interesting if you look at, for example, the Bigfoot research organization called the BFRO. They have a website where they have hundreds and hundreds of people who have cited Bigfoot. It's a database of people who've seen Bigfoot. And if you go look, they're categorized by what kind of a sighting it was. And a lot of them are things like, I was camping and I heard a noise, which I didn't recognize the animal, so I presume it's Bigfoot. It was too large, the thing moving in the woods. It had to be Bigfoot.
Right.
I saw a brown hairy shape, And a lot of these things are places where people could be seeing bears. There seems to be a strong correspondence between bear territory and Bigfoot territory. And the skeptic might think, oh, well, that correlation is probably because those people are seeing bears, not Bigfoot. But a person who was into cryptozoology would say, that is because the habitat of Bigfoot corresponds heavily to bears. You see, and it's a small distinction, but
right.
It's how you look at it. And I think the skeptical position would be, where's the proof? And that's the bottom line. Where's the proof? And to go from I think Bigfoot's a neat idea, let me look into that, to, oh boy, I've looked at lots and lots of evidence, and the evidence for Bigfoot's not very good. That's a long walk. It is a long walk, and not everybody gets to the end of it. Some people just decide, oh, there's plenty of evidence. That's enough for me. Even though I've never seen a Bigfoot, I presume they're real.
That's definitely the problem. There are just thousands of contributions from people on that site, and for them that proof is enough, or that this evidence they deem to be good evidence and sufficient for them to have these beliefs.
Yeah, I think Michael Shermer and his group, he in particular has talked about why people believe weird things. And it seems like in Shermer's case, he's become more interested in why people believe than whether any individual thing is true or not. You can always get to, is there evidence or not? And that's the end of that argument. If you can't find the evidence for it, then you don't really have necessarily a cause to believe. But the why people believe brings you into so much more interesting territory about people's dispositions for what they'll accept, the sort of mental and spiritual states these sort of surprising encounters can have on people, people who are fantasy prone, the fallibility of the human eye, the fallibility of the human mind, the sort of preloading or being primed for a particular find. So if you're told a house is haunted and you're staying there and you hear mysterious noises, you're maybe inclined to think, oh, it's a ghost, rather than, oh, that's the attic fan or whatever other, mundane cause maybe behind it. And I think that people can get primed for Bigfoot or Nessie in the same sort of way. And then whenever they see something anomalous, then they just fill in the blank with the creature that they expect.
Well, that's why I think Myron is such a valuable asset to us as a previous Bigfoot believer, and having supposedly had a Bigfoot sighting as well, that he's come over from the dark side, so to speak, and he's a link between believers and skeptics. So he's
that missing link. Yep.
The missing link, yes. Missing monster link.
We have a question from the chat room.
From Kennedy G. Cryptozoology is amongst the low-hanging fruit of critical thinking. Their bad logic is just so dumb in most cases. How does this garbage propagate?
It propagates through message boards on the internet and through the History Channel documentaries. That was sort of a joke.
Yeah, I was waiting for more.
But it's true. I mean, they really are. I mean, it is so easy to put together a glossy TV show that says, in the woods, a mysterious creature. And then you throw in your, beautiful CGI video of what the creature may have looked like. And she claimed it was 8 feet tall and 600 pounds. And you look at that video and you hear her talk about, I know what I saw. And wow, that's pretty compelling,
and because this is folklore as well, a lot of it is just word of mouth and, water cooler conversation and what people tell each other. That's how these things disseminate.
That's right. The dissemination is usually word of mouth. And now that we've added internet, Twitter, Facebook, all these sort of new network tools beyond the telephone, then those kinds of stories can propagate much quicker. Although, to the credit of cryptozoology, a lot of the people who are serious about it also are really good at spotting hoaxes because they don't like to be made fun of. So in cases like the Bigfoot hoax in Georgia a couple of years ago, the Bigfoot in a freezer, within hours of that coming out, not only did the cryptozoologists know that it was fake, but they knew specifically what kind of suit it was. So it's hard to fool. Those guys get fooled too many times, and they're very good at spotting an obvious hoax.
Yeah, well, that gives them credibility to say occasionally, well, this is a hoax or this is not true.
Yeah, they want to believe, but a lot of the serious people really want to find solid evidence, and they think it's just a matter of time. And again, the skeptic position, the right position is, if the evidence shows up, examine it. If it's good evidence, great. Then, hey, there's a Bigfoot. I'd love to see Bigfoot turn out to be true, but I just think it's unlikely.
We actually have a phone call. Go ahead, caller.
I was just wondering, do you think all of these cryptozoologists are just neglectfully ignorant towards everything, or do you think they actually truly believe all of this and they're just trying to go with it?
There's a broad spectrum of people who are interested in cryptozoology. The most serious people can even be like biologists and Darren Naish, for example, is almost made his doctoral degree in biology, or I think, or it might have been paleontology. But at any degree, he's a very, very scientific type person who also is very interested in cryptozoology. I think would probably self-identify as both a scientist, a science advocate, and a cryptozoologist. And then it goes down from there. People who are very unscientific. There's a big, strong contingent of young Earth creationists who really want to find a living dinosaur and believe that those cryptid creatures are real because they think that finding one will prove that the Earth is, about 6,000 years old and that the Great Flood happened and that evolution is false. That's a flawed premise, but they're out there, and some of them support the ideas of especially living fossils type cryptids for that reason.
Now, cryptozoologists and cryptozoology enthusiasts will often argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That is technically true?
That is true, right. And that's really important for their position. You can't prove a negative. Okay, technically, I think if you talk to a philosopher, there's certain cases when you can. But besides that, without being pedantic, in general, you can't prove a negative. However, without sort of the opposite of that, in a debate, typically the person making the case has the burden of proof. And without the burden of proof, if the burden of proof is in place without actual evidence, then there is no case. So the case for Bigfoot right now is not very strong because all there are footprints, but there's no DNA in those footprints. And there are ways to hoax footprints, and there's bad photographs.
So when do you get to the point where research is about a particular creature? When is it safe to assume that this creature doesn't exist? At least in practice.
I would say that the unicorn has sort of reached that threshold. I think people. In general, I think people really thought it was a real animal for a long time, and it's moved into the realm of. I think most people would agree it's just a fantasy creature. The Jersey Devil is, I think, on the cusp of it. Some of the creatures that are considered cryptids are so implausible. They would be really, really, really unlikely from an evolutionary perspective. For example, the Ropen, which is supposed to be some sort of living pterosaur in Papua New Guinea or in the New Guinea area, is supposed to be a flying creature that looks kind of like it's an ancient flying reptile, but it's also bioluminescent, which, if you think about it, that would be a really strange trait for a creature who lived in the air to have. If it was a predator, being bioluminescent would be really unusual. In fact, if you think about it, I don't believe there's any terrestrial bioluminescent vertebrates. So it would be unusual in many, many ways for it to pop up and be a real creature. So in those cases where it defies not just logic, it would be unusual for a large lake monster to actually be a living Mesozoic marine reptile, for example,
right,
when it survived, because we just don't have any fossil evidence of them surviving beyond the extinction 65 million years ago. It'd be cool if they do. I mean, that'd be fabulous, but there's just no evidence for it. So in those cases, I'm almost always inclined to think that lake monsters, which appear to be plesiosaurs or that sort of thing, are heavily biased towards folklore.
But even the popular cryptids like Bigfoot really should have gone the way of the unicorn so far, just with the lack of evidence. But
yes,
it's just being kept afloat with folklore.
And History Channel documentaries.
Yes, that's a given.
Audience, if you have questions about when to give up your childhood dreams, email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com or tweet us at skepticalradio. So scientists do discover new animal species fairly frequently, though, correct?
Yeah, they're just typically not very large. So there was a big, I don't want to say a wave, I'm not sure what the right word is. There was a very large collection of them found recently, I saw in the news a few weeks ago. and they just found a large monitor lizard, I think in the Philippines, that was unusual in that it looked almost like a Komodo dragon type creature, but it was apparently a vegetarian. So, but those are the large animals like that are unusual to uncover, and typically it happens not when in a large populated area, but in a remote area where people haven't been able to explore before. So that's one of the, I keep bringing Bigfoot up, but although there are large rural areas, and many people in the city who watch TV shows about the outdoors might get the impression that these huge open expanses, are unexplored. But the fact is, people wouldn't be able to have these sightings if these creatures, if they're real, were not in human-occupied territory. So you can't have it both ways. A place, the monster can't be so rural that it can stay hidden, yet also be being spotted. One of those things is wrong.
Yeah, but finding a bug or a fish clearly isn't as exciting as finding a Bigfoot.
No, not really.
We have a question on that topic from the chat.
This question is from PHI Guy. It is, considering that cryptozoologists are among those that Randy calls unsinkable rubber duckies, have you ever managed to convince a believer? Do you have an example of a slam dunk?
We've had a couple of emails from listeners who decided after listening to our show, I don't know if they just from listening to our show or from doing additional research after listening to our show, have changed their positions on certain creatures. So I would say we're doing positive work with our show. Our show, though, to be fair, is not just us getting on each week and saying there's no such thing as monsters. I think that would get dull really fast. My idea for the show in general was to use cryptozoology and monsters as a launching point for scientific discovery or scientific discussions, rather. So
that's implicit.
Yeah. So that's we don't just sit around and talk about mysteries. We talk about what we can know, what is possible, and what science has discovered about these topics.
Yeah, and clearly someone like Myron is a great example of someone who's come over to the skeptical side.
True enough.
Not through us, but...
Well, yeah. To be fair, so would I be. I certainly didn't start off in a position of complete doubt. It took a long time.
Let's talk about some of those cases that do make believers out of people. So Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster. I just want to say Chupacabra over and over because it's a great name. Are there any truth to any of those at all? Any evidence at all?
No, but
No.
That's the short answer. If you look at Nessie,
and the precise one.
We like to look at case zero when we're looking at these kinds of questions. When was the first sighting? So, an animal doesn't just spring into being suddenly, right? That typically, if people have been in an area for hundreds of years, they would have seen the fauna of that area for hundreds of years, right? So in the case of those three animals, Nessie really didn't have any, existence before the 1930s when the story sort of sprang out of nowhere. There's some vague legends in that area that they tried to say were pertinent, but not really. This is a 20th century invention. And Bigfoot sort of sprang into being in the 1950s. Same thing. There really just wasn't any history. There's some people who like to say that Native American folklore, which deals with sort of wood spirits and wild men of the woods, that those are actually talking about Bigfoot. And so they're saying that this Native American folklore about spirit animals is really talking about a real animal. But they don't make that same claim for talking coyotes or talking ravens or talking foxes. So, and then the Chupacabra, that's really Ben's specialty creature, but it also just sprang into being, I'll mess up the date. I want to say it was in the late 80s. It was in the 80s. And that doesn't happen, especially on an island. It started in Puerto Rico, and there were animal attacks, but some of the main claims for the creature, the main claim for the creature is that it drains the animals it eats of blood. So it attacks and drains the creatures of blood. And if you look at the way the creature is described, it doesn't seem like any sort of earthly normal animal. But the evidence really didn't hold up. The corpses were not actually drained of blood. And when the legend, the folklore started to move on to the mainland, then the creatures sort of changed, and now a hairless dog can be called a chupacabra when that's really not at all what the original creatures looked like.
What's the deal with all the parallel legends? For example, the lake monster. Nessie's the archetype, but Wikipedia, I looked, and it lists 72 different lake monsters, and 16 of which are here in Canada. You're welcome. Why is that so universal?
Well, where do monsters live? Right? I mean, where are the first monsters you encounter growing up?
Under your bed. Under
your bed and in the closet. They're where you can't see. They're in the unknown.
I got it right.
So these creatures and I think they're being invented. They're fulfilling sort of a need for us to have this fear of the unknown, and they're putting a face to it. I think that's a little bit pop sci, but we seem to have a need for something to fear. I don't know why.
Yeah.
And we have a need to tell stories, right? So
some of these creatures are created by parents as well to instill fear into the kids for some social conditioning, like the Lugaroo, I think, is that in the South? I think you've got that creature in the South.
I think that's a Louisiana thing, yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it depends on what state and what country you're talking about, but I think that's used as a threat for kiddies. If you escape the house at night or if you play up, then you're going to be attacked by this monster. But they do vary across cultures and across time, and it is fascinating to see how even these very popular cryptids haven't been around terribly long when you think about it in the scope of things.
Right. So it's very easy to say, well, there's a lake monster in Loch Ness. I saw something unusual in the lake. So it's obviously the same sort of thing. And it could be there. I mean, you can't have the same kind of lake monster in a lake that was built by the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1950s. There's no reason why there would be a dinosaur hiding there, because there wasn't even a lake there long enough. You know what I mean? But these kinds of things, the wild men in the woods, there's localized versions of Bigfoot all over the U.S. 3-toed, 4-toed, 5-toed, different heights. It's crazy. I mean, well, I don't want to say it's crazy. That's not very polite, but it's
you are on a Canadian station.
Yeah. And certainly overseas as well, not just in the States. You've got the Yeti and the Yowie and the abominable snowman.
True enough.
There's different variants.
You guys, we have so many questions piled up for you. It's insane. What we're going to do is go to a break and figure out which ones will be the lucky questions to be answered on air. So last chance, people, if you have a question for Blake and Karen from the MonsterTalk podcast, now's your chance. Email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com. Tweet us at Skeptical Radio, and we'll be right back with that plethora of questions right after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we get in touch with the next generation of critical thinkers. We're joined by 3 members of the Young Australian Skeptics. Jack Scanlon, Elliot Birch, and Jason Ball will share their experiences about living as young skeptics and trying to spread critical thinking to their peers. And on Speaking Up, we talk to members of the Woo Fighters, a new group promoting critical thinking among college students. The work of young skeptics. Next week on Skeptically Speaking, Friday night at 6 p.m. Mountain Time at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm here with Blake Smith and Karen Stollznow, 2 of the hosts of the MonsterTalk podcast, one of the official podcasts of Skeptic Magazine. We have a question submitted before the show.
I have to admit, I hadn't heard of MonsterTalk prior to the show, so forgive me if this is something you talk about often. I was wondering about something that actually came up in episode number 23 of Skeptically Speaking. That is, the boost of the tourism industry based on the myth of the creature whose existence can't be, or at least hasn't been verified. Specifically on that show, the Ogopogo was discussed, but this goes for any creature, really. Do you think it's irresponsible for people to perpetuate such myths in order to sell toys, T-shirts, and other trinkets, or is it all just good fun? And that's from Lee in Winnipeg.
We had a good example of this with the Ghost Bird show. I don't know what number that was, Blake. Do you remember?
No, I'd have to look it up. But it was recent.
And that was a story of the ivory-billed woodpecker.
That's correct.
And this was a creature discovered or that had been extinct for how many years? Maybe about 60 years?
Yeah.
And was believed to be found again in Arkansas recently. And so that in this little town, this little truck stop, this had just turned the town into a big sort of, well, they wanted it to become a sort of tourist town as a result of that. And so they anticipated that and prepared T-shirts and all kinds of memorabilia and stuff to make it available to the hordes of tourists that would flock to the place. And that didn't actually happen for the town. But I think often I know living in California and traveling throughout all of the Bigfoot areas, the famed areas here like Willow Creek, these are very small country towns and they really do thrive on their reputation. So whether there's something there or not, that is a draw card for them. And I can understand them doing that. And if people are getting a kick out of it and like to go to these places for that reason, whether they believe or not, I don't really see that there's a problem so much with that.
Yeah, it's ironic. This actually came up in an interview I just did with Joe Nickel, which will be in our next episode. And we were talking about Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster and some of these they're not obscure, but maybe less famous than Bigfoot creatures. And he said that, in his opinion, one of the cycles that happens repeatedly in these kind of cases is a monster flap happens. He called it a flap. When you have multiple sightings over time, and then it'll die down, and then a new generation will come up and ask questions about it, and then the stories will be retold in an embellished way, and then the next thing that happens is somebody in the city council or somebody in sort of a civic advocacy group, or maybe it's Chamber of Commerce, will come up with the idea of having a festival, and then the next thing you have is an annual retelling and revisitation of the monster legends. And that's where the commerce comes in, right? So he says, in his experience, he's been doing this for a long time, that's actually part of the evolution of the story is when they sort of monetize it and commercialize it and make a festival.
Interesting. We have that in Australia, in a place called Campbelltown. There's a legend of a fellow called Tom Fisher and his ghost, and so every year there's a festival in honour of that.
So that's that's part of it. It's considered to be part of it.
Yeah, it's part of the cycle. You wouldn't really expect to monetize it during the initial claim period, right? It would be after it's really gotten
established.
I think it's like I think what was it in Chinatown that I think they said whores, politicians, and old buildings all become respectable with age. And I believe that's also true for monster legends. So
I have not heard that and considered that completely stolen. Awesome. We have another question from the website.
I would like to know if I were to put a really large spotlight on my roof, would I attract Mothman? I saw this done on Aqua Teen Hunger Force. Also, if a large fire was built, would the Mothman fly into it? And if so, is it likely that this has already occurred and covered up by the government?
And that was from Myron, but you mentioned Mothman, so...
But to be fair, I think Joe Nickel makes a very good case that Mothman is a barred owl with a D, barred owl. But to learn more about Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster, you can tune into the next episode of Monster Talk.
And we have another question from the chat.
This is from Northern Skeptic. Question is, which cryptid do you think would make the best addition to a restaurant menu?
Well, one of my favorite cryptids is the Kraken, which turned out to be at least the giant squid. When I was a kid, it was still a mystery creature. And in my lifetime, I've seen that one turn out to be a real animal, which is kind of cool. And I actually had a chance to talk to one of the biologists who does a lot of research with Architeuthis, which is that type of squid, and asked him if it would be edible. And he said that the giant squid and the colossal squid are really high in ammonia content, that their meat is not edible by humans because of the ammonia content. So, but it would look the coolest. I'd love to see some like 3.5-inch, 4-inch calamari rings. That'd be pretty awesome.
I think the Loch Ness Monster would make a lot of sushi.
We have another question from the website. I think I'm going to dispense with my questions. We have more than enough.
How much effect do you think the internet has had on the popularity of cryptozoology? And that's from Sharon Hill.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for listening. I think that they've had a big impact because it's allowed people who had what was once an esoteric type of knowledge to be able to reach out and become a community, in the same way that many micro communities have discovered that even though they may only number in the hundreds in their own town, that over the spread of the internet, there's thousands or millions of them. So the internet's really good at doing that. For good or for ill, it lets people get in touch with each other, and it lets information be free, even if that information is erroneous and based on folklore and not on hard science.
Yeah, I think as Blake touched upon earlier, all of the forums and websites that are available, people are able to reach out to each other and retell their stories, and the anecdotal evidence is spread that way. So it's really popularized it.
Well, I realize I do have one question, so sorry, everybody who has emailed. You're going to have to wait 1 second. Myron Getman's original thesis of speaking up today was that cryptozoology was a real threat to science literacy.
In the end, I don't know if I agree with that, in that it's no more of a threat than any kind of, how do I say this without being derogatory? Well, just say any irrational belief system. And there's plenty of well-entrenched irrational belief systems that people have, which seem harmless, which can in cases be harmless, and which are so complicated that it may not actually be fair to say that the harm outweighs the good, right? So, without calling names on particular beliefs, right? It's easy to say, like, I like to go to What's the Harm, Tim Farley's site, what'stheharm.net, and look at cases, and because it lets you see things like homeopathy can kill people, anti-vaccination scares can kill people. There's not a lot of cases where believing in Bigfoot killed somebody. So the direct harm there may not be as obvious. Does that, I guess the question is it a cause and effect thing? In other words, would believing in Bigfoot lead you to believe other crazy things? Or does a propensity for having that kind of belief just mean it more likely that you would believe in Bigfoot? Right. So it's really hard to answer that as a cause, or, which causes what.
Well, I think too, since this area isn't taught in any formal way, it's not taught in schools, it's not taught at tertiary level, I don't think there's too much fear of it really infiltrating society through any sort of educational stream.
And while I don't necessarily agree with that conclusion that Myron had, I really agree with a lot of the things he had to say. So, I don't want to disenfranchise him.
Too much.
Well, we have a sort of related question from the website.
Cryptozoologists take a similar stance to intelligent design proponents, that they're looking at the same evidence and just reaching a different conclusion. Do they make similar claims to being unfairly ignored or marginalized by mainstream science?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They really do. And there's even people who believe that there's a conspiracy of scientists to cover up the truth about the cryptids that are lurking all over the world. So, once you've taken that sort of conspiratorial approach to life, and you're not really looking for the hard evidence to back it up, and why would you? Because clearly the evidence has been covered up as part of the conspiracy. Once you take that worldview, it's a downward spiral.
And the last question from the website.
What do you think is the effect of high-profile hoaxes? I'm thinking of the Georgia men back in August of 2008 who claimed that they discovered the body of a dead Bigfoot. The story was covered all over the world with some very prominent Bigfoot researchers getting involved. Later, it turned out to be a costume stuffed into a freezer. Do you think hoaxes like this undermine popular belief in cryptids, or can they actually reinforce it?
I think in this case, they uncovered a need for Bigfoot that people didn't know existed, because when that happened, the internet became quasi unusable. I mean, it went crazy. Websites like CNN.com and Fox News became sluggish. Just so many hits for people wanting to see this Bigfoot. And the irony was, I thought that the cryptozoology community knew, like I say, within an hour probably or so, that not only was it a fake, but specifically how the fake was done. So they weren't fooling the cryptozoology fans.
They spoke out about it as well, so I think that didn't really do much to undermine the movement at all, because they were saying, "Oh, this is a hoax."
Exactly. What it did do is it demonstrated that need for Bigfoot evidence is out there. People want to see Bigfoot. People want it to be true.
They're looking for it.
Yeah, and then it also. I have very mixed feelings about the whole thing, because hoaxes, I disagree with hoaxes. I think they can have some purpose. But those guys in particular, I've been trying to get them on my show to talk about their causes, why they actually chose to do this.
They're as elusive as Bigfoot.
They are. They're still trying to make money doing it. They're still trying to make money as Bigfoot trackers. They basically want to pay money to them, and then they will take you on an expedition to see Bigfoot, which is the same sort of, I would say, gimmick that the BFRO does, where they take you out in the woods and you hear Bigfoot knocking on trees with sticks and people, Bigfoot making howls in the darkness, but you're not allowed to go look for it. So there's ways to monetize this sort of doubt or this sort of mystery.
You guys, that's all the time we have for today.
Good night, Canada.
Thanks so much for being with us, Blake and Karen.
Follow me on Twitter, Dr. Lennis.
You can check out MonsterTalk at skeptic.com/podcasts/MonsterTalk. And yes, disappointed people who emailed me, Ben Radford is the other lovely host of MonsterTalk. And he wasn't on the show today. I do plan to invite him, but as with many skeptics, he has multiple areas of expertise. Karen, for example, does paranormal research, but we didn't get into that today. And I really, really wanted to talk about ghost sex.
We sacked Ben, actually. He doesn't know it yet.
That's sacked, not sucked.
Right. It took me a second, actually.
Fired.
So Ben actually does paranormal research as well and media analysis, and I do want to give those topics enough attention, and therefore separate shows. So
if anybody has questions that didn't get answered, they can hit us at contact@monstertalk.org, and we'll get back with them.
Perfect. You can find us at skepticallyspeaking.com. Follow the links to everywhere we exist on the intertubes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on. The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's spells. Cause we're skeptically speaking. Our mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks. All the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan woo. I don't think you understand. It's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor. Leave the pieces alone. We don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on. The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
On Skeptically Speaking, we discuss a wide range of skeptical and science topics with a variety of experts. But I'd like to remind you that you, yes, you personally, are invited to join us on air every week for Speaking Up. Because let's face it, outreach is a part of skepticism. We all do it, whether we're talking to our parents about why they shouldn't buy into that multi-level marketing scheme, explaining the misinformation around vaccines to our coworkers, or forwarding that Snopes entry on why typing in your PIN number backward on the ATM machine does not, in fact, summon the police. But if you want to take your skeptical activism one step further and reach a broader audience, we're here for you. Do you have an event coming up that you'd like to promote? Or maybe you're a blogger that's been doing some great work and you'd like to talk about it? Or you'd just like to get some experience speaking publicly on a science or skeptical topic? What better way to get some real-world practice than on a friendly, rational radio show? If you're ready to have your say, do send an email to feedback@skepticallyspeaking.com. Put speaking up in the subject line, tell us a bit about what you'd like to discuss, and we'll contact you to set up your very own 10 to 15 minutes of on-air goodness. We're looking forward to hearing from you.